speak to the subject. I may not, I don't know how much I'm going to get involved in it, but the subject is we forget the lessons of history. I don't know how long ago it was, but it was years and years and years ago in my life when I heard someone say that one of the lessons of history that we quickly forget is that we don't learn the lessons of history. And when I look around today at what we are dealing with, some of us were talking on Zoom just a moment ago about the loss of I think it was 5 people in that little submarine type machine that was going to go down and take a look at the Titanic, and which was a ship that was state of the art at its time and was thought to be almost unsinkable. I think it was actually said that it was unsinkable. Uh, and yet, through some poor judgment on the part of, from what I know about the Titanic, some poor judgment on the part of the captain and upper officers, why it did sink. And then apparently just recently, in an effort to take some tourists down to take a look at the Hulk line on the bottom of the ocean, probably the ship or the submarine, whatever you want to call it, that it was in, it imploded and probably killed all 5 people, based on what I've heard, almost instantly. And and yet we, we had 2 situations there where you have a a captain of a ship, the Titanic, that demonstrated that I don't care how technologically advanced it is for its day, whatever the vehicle is you're traveling in, if you don't use good judgment and you don't learn from other people's mistakes, you'll make the same kind of mistake and you will create a catastrophe like the Titanic was. Then here we are, what is it, roughly 100 years later, I think it is, and another captain of another type of ship using another state of the art, hopefully, technology failed to use good judgment, and he created another catastrophe. He didn't learn. And that's something, since I picked this subject, that's come to a conclusion after the fact of thinking about this subject. But my thoughts were thinking back more practical and down to earth. I was born and raised in Los Angeles County. I'll put it that way, in California. Those who know California know that's the southern part of the state. It's a little bit north of San Diego, a little bit north of Long Beach, very little bit north of Long Beach. And I was raised there in a time when probably my memories go back to 1942, 3, 4, 5 when they started. And I actually remember being at meetings in downtown Los Angeles. And the buildings were rented in literally in the center city of Los Angeles. And the people who were holding the meetings that my parents attended, they would rent a building, and it was in downtown Los Angeles, and I don't remember the names of the streets, but the streets ran parallel to each other, and you would rent a building on one street, and if you were up on the second or more floors of that building, there was a catwalk that you could go across to a comparable building on the street. In my picture, I would say that it would be east of the street that the building that we were using was in. And you look down in the alleys of that street, I was born in 39, so I was probably 6, 5, 6, 7, 8 in that age bracket. And I could see homeless people in the alley below the catwalk, and they were living in cardboard boxes. And like I say, from that time on, I lived in that part of the world up until I was roughly 20 years old, and then I moved to San Luis Obispo, California, and I lived there for a while, and then anyway, moved on from there to various places. But as I saw 2 weeks ago, I think it was, or thereabouts, an interview a man that I won't use any names because I don't know that I could even pronounce the man's names, the man's name accurately, but he interviews people and his focus is generally on California and California issues. And of course, that being the case, then homelessness, particularly in large cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, is a big issue. And when you interview somebody, and I've heard him several times interview different people on the same subject, and you get back to homelessness and then housing shortages, or is it a drug issue? Is there a solution? Can there be a solution? And it's interesting to me that actually these kinds of questions and these kinds of problems, they've been, I mean, California has climate, particularly along the coast, that's very conducive to people being homeless and people being reasonably comfortable, even in a cardboard box in an alley between two buildings in the center of downtown Los Angeles. But it was interesting that the person that was being interviewed was a person that apparently has been a drug addict, has been homeless, has managed to climb out of that, and is spending most of his life, apparently, his efforts, his focus to try to help people that are living in that situation. And he was frustrated by the fact that he could not, the leadership in control was not dealing with the problem in such a way that would really be of help to the homeless and the drug addicts that are living their lives on the streets of Los Angeles, California. I think the area where he spends most of his time, although it did indicate some knowledge of San Francisco and other areas. Man, he'd been in a situation where apparently where the legislators in the state of California, and maybe it was in the federal government too, but where they had been talking about the homeless population and what could they do about it. And so it's interesting. It was interesting to me that as he understood what was trying to be done on a legislative level, that basically the leadership did not see any value in dealing legally, arresting, putting in jail, or whatever the case might be, drug peddlers who lived in these areas of the homeless people. And when the homeless people maybe wanted help, but they couldn't get help from the authorities fast enough because the bureaucracy only moves at a very slow pace. And finally, in desperation, they would go back out on the street to their local friendly drug dealer and buy whatever the drug of their favor was, and go down the tube again into a semi-numb state. And many of them are getting fentanyl and things like that that are killing people, and he was talking about it. But he was indicating that the people in the legislature that he was hearing were saying, what's the value in arresting a drug dealer and putting him in jail? What's the value in putting a homeless person in a situation where they can't get their drugs? Like, there's no solution. And so I'm left with the question, what makes capable men and women, because I would have to, they're at least educated, that's for sure, but why would they think there would be any benefit to mankind or society or the culture they're in to not remove the people that are contributing to the deterioration of their society, one way or the other, either by capital punishment or by putting them in jail for an extended period of time if necessary? Why do they think there's going to be any value? How are we going to survive if we continue to allow these people to live what is, according to God's word, an ungodly lifestyle? and people get rich selling a product that's killing the people that are living that lifestyle, how does anybody think that they can let that go on unchecked? Whether it's riots in the streets, whether it's burning buildings, breaking into storefronts, and they talk all about the businesses that are having to leave some of the major cities, major businesses, major corporations, and nobody seems to think that there's any value to the city or to the people. If somebody says, wait a minute, we're not going to let immoral, ungodly, indecent people destroy our lifestyle because we're afraid to deal with and stop what they're doing. We're not going to do that because they could stop it. And that's part of the lessons of history that we don't remember. We have been in the United States in situations where certain cities have been run by illegal elements of their city. And they've gotten away with it for a period of time. And then finally people have said, okay, that's enough. And they've hired a mayor, or they've voted in a mayor, or hired prosecutors, or whatever they've done, that have begun to enforce the laws, and in some cases write new laws, to enable them to deal with crime and indecency and immorality. And they've turned the cities around. And I've lived long enough to now see some of those same cities going back down the tube, so to speak, because politicians and apparently wealthy people in parts of the world that have enough money that they think they can get prosecutors and mayors and people like that voted into power who will not enforce the laws that we have, and that it'll benefit somebody. That's I don't know who they think it's going to benefit, but the fact of the matter is, it won't. It won't. And it's been proven already in the history of my life, which is not any great length. It's 83 years, which I'm very thankful for. But in my life, I've seen cities in this country that have gone down the tube, come up again, change of political regime and law enforcement models, and turn it around. And now I'm living in a time when I'm seeing them go back down the tube again. And I don't know whether they'll ever be able to come back up again or not, because I don't know whether this is indicative of what the Bible prophesies as the end of mankind on earth as we know it and understand it. I don't know. But the question sometimes I have a hard time. I believe the Bible, and I read about biblical history, and then I compare a little bit and read a lot. I like a lot to read about history of mankind. And I don't know anywhere in the Bible or anything that I know in secular history that would cause any great civilization to think that they could survive for any significant length of time after they morally had deteriorated to the condition that the Bible describes as a country, a nation, a city, a town given over by what is described as sin, with no fear of consequences on the part of the government or citizenry. How can we deteriorate morally and slack off in our law enforcement conviction of crimes and punishment for crimes? What makes us think that we can do that and benefit anybody? Anybody. And I personally am much more familiar with biblical history and think it's more relevant to the subject than secular history. But in both cases, what little I know of secular history and what I know of biblical history, and of course, when you go into the scriptures, you read about Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon and and the countries that followed, and yet it's like nobody will go back and read history and say, okay, this is what brought the end of this society about. This is what happened before God did something about a society. This and it's always been bad. And the same with different forms of government, socialism, communism. They've all been tried. Kings, they've all been tried. and we have a form of government that is, as far as I know, the best that mankind has ever come up with for a group of people to function, but yet it's going backwards from where it started a couple hundred plus years ago. So I don't know. And so when I go back to the Bible, I find that God has warned his people Israel. You don't want to forget the lessons of your history, because the lessons of history, if you're familiar with the Bible at all, whether we go back to all the way back, and I will go there in just a minute, but all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and the consequences for disregarding what God called sin are not good. And the consequences of ignoring the result of disobeying God are not good. And so to me, when we go back to the Garden of Eden, if we start in Genesis chapter 1, as I've said many times in the last year or so, but we start what I think is the first significant, you might say, break or section in the Bible, Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 11. And it's the pre-Abrahamic period of time covered in the Bible, and it covers roughly 2,000 years of history in just 11 little chapters, and so we don't get much detail. But to me, it's Israel, as they began their life from Genesis 12 on, where God called Abraham, promised Abraham a land, a number of descendants, children that he could not count them any more than he could count the stars or the sand on the seashore. A certain one of his descendants that would bless all nations, that kings would come from his loins, that they would be given a specific land, and it's described in metes and bounds in a number of places in the Bible. And it would be a promise that would go from Abraham to Isaac through Jacob, and therefore for the nation Israel, the Jews, a people that still exist on this earth, still have not received the ultimate provision that was promised to Abraham, but still will someday. A nation that has been at the point of and a goal and a desire for people all over the world, over the history of mankind, to want to exterminate, but they've never succeeded and they never will. But they were warned, they were told, and of course ultimately they went down into bondage in Egypt, and they were there until there was a Pharaoh that rose that didn't know Joseph, who was the one that went down into Egypt, and then his brothers came down when there was a famine in the land, and then the Egyptians became afraid of them, and they were trying to kill them. And they were trying to kill them by working them to death as slaves. And then God remembered his promise to Abraham. confirmed to Isaac and Jacob. And he led them out of that bondage. And he told them, don't forget your history. But it's important that we remember that they also knew the history of the period of time before Abraham, chapter 12 of Genesis, that ends with chapter 11 in the book of Genesis. And they knew what happened when God gave some simple instruction to Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve chose to ignore it. And for me, we live in a time when most anybody that has any kind of education at all knows that we in this time in our culture in the United States of America have legalized and chosen not to prosecute people engaged in conduct that the Bible describes as sin in God's eyes. Doesn't make any difference whether it's sin in my eyes or your eyes or not. If you know that it's sin in God's eyes and you're very smart and you know something of history, you're not going to tolerate that kind of conduct as being okay, being in the best interest of those engaged in it, or in the best interest of the country or the city or whatever it is that condones it. It's not okay. So just a couple of three quick references in Deuteronomy and one in 2 Kings, but just to emphasize the fact, God told Israel, don't forget the lessons of your history. Don't forget. In Deuteronomy 34:12, and you'd have to go into the context to get the context, because I'm not going to take the time this morning to do it, but by all that might and power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel, and the exhortation is, don't forget it. All the might and power and the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of Israel. Because as God was bringing Israel out of the land of Egypt, Moses represented God in many tough situations. In chapter 24 of Deuteronomy, when you reap your harvest in your field, and you forget a sheaf in the field, you should not go back and get it. It should be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widows, and that the Lord God bless you in all the work of your hands. And in that context, they were told, remember where you were. Remember where you were as you were brought out of Egypt. In chapter 25, it shall be when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around in the land your God, the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, that you shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. Don't forget what the Amalekites did. Don't forget that God judged them. Don't forget. And then in 2 Kings chapter 7, the covenant that I have made with you, Israel, you shall not forget, nor shall you fear other gods. They were told to do things that were to remind them over and over and over again not to forget. And going back in Deuteronomy to chapter 8, we read, every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe. Okay, now then, Israel was called of God. Israel was protected of God. Israel was blessed by God. Israel was saved out of Egypt from being destroyed physically. And they get to Mount Sinai, and God says, if you do what I tell you to do, I'll make you a great nation. And they, in their really pride and arrogance, said, well, all God tells us to do, we'll do. So God gave them the Ten Commandments, the Mosaic Law, the sacrifices, the ordinances, all of that package that went together that's described in Galatians as a schoolmaster to lead them to Christ, that they might be saved and be accepted of God. But so the exhortation is, every commandment which I command you, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, and you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord, from God. Your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. You should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. Okay, that isn't any, that should be something that today, if the heart of man in the world and in the United States of America was right toward God, we would want to find out what it is that pleases God. And we should expect that if God is for us, who can be against us, so to speak? If God is against us, I don't care who's for us, we're going to come out on the wrong end of the deal. It's not going to work well. And so Israel, if you go back and remember the history of Israel, they were to go in and possess the land, and then they sent in spies, and the 12 spies came back, and they all agreed that it was a great land. It flowed with milk and honey. The people prospered. But then there was the majority of them, 10 of them, that said, we were like grasshoppers in their eyes, and we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes. We can't take them. If we try to possess this land, our children will all die. And Caleb and Joshua, the only two of the spies that went in, they said, if God will give us the land, if God be for us, we can take the land. What made the difference? The size of the two people? No. The might of the two people, as far as the tools of war that they might have had or not had? No. The difference was going to be found in the fact that God was going to give them that land. And they wouldn't go take it. So God said, okay, go out and wander in the wilderness. Took 40 years. Everyone that's 21 years of old and older will die. And then I'll take your children that you said would die if you went in and took the land now. I'll take your children and take them into the land. Okay, the children of Israel that went into that land needed to remember their history. They needed to remember that godliness paid off. They need to remember that the people that occupied that land that flowed with milk and honey, that they were going to possess, and they were going to live in houses they didn't build, and reap the fruit from the trees that they didn't plant, and crops from ground that they didn't initially till, they were going to be blessed. But the people whose land they were taking over because they had disobeyed God. And their land was known as for its immorality and its pagan worship and its idol worship and its immoral conduct in worship of their false gods. And what are we doing today? What are we doing today as a nation, as a people? There've been all kinds of push of late about the LGBTQ, and who they are and what they are and how they need to be protected and how people don't know whether they're male or female or they may be male and female or they may feel. And I pulled up an article from the Anna E. Casey Foundation from their webpage, and it lists 35 words that describe people that are struggling with this issue of LGBTQ plus, and the initials keep going, but 35 different ones. And they really are all, they're not new thoughts, they're not new issues. The conduct that they describe or the feelings about oneself that they describe, that's not new. That's been going on forever. It's mentioned in the Bible. But their feelings. And children are being talked about the fact that, are you really what you physiologically appear to be, male or female? What in the world makes anybody think that that's going to benefit children? But anyway, that's what's going on. And yet there are people today, many of whom are afraid to say, hey, what are we doing? What does God say about that conduct, sexual conduct between people? Does God say anything about it? Does he? I'll suggest that he does. And before I get through the subject, why, I hope that you will agree that he does. But again, Israel, back to Deuteronomy chapter 8, your garments didn't wear out for 40 years. Your feet did not swell as you wandered for 40 years. And you should know from that experience in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. And because of that, therefore, verse 6 says, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to fear him, have an awesome respect for him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, that flows out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees, of pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. And when you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. But remember, he starts out, be careful to observe. Remember the lessons that you've learned. Remember what you should have learned by the fact that when God would have taken you in 40 years before, you could have had the land. But you didn't obey God. You didn't trust God. You didn't believe God. You didn't believe that godliness is profitable unto all things, having the promise not only of the life that now is, but that which is to come. And that's not a statement of fact that's written for the nation Israel exclusively. That's true. That's always been true. Going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, it was true. And if anybody would learn the lessons of history, they will know from biblical history, all the way back to the Garden of Eden, the first man and the first woman, had the opportunity to make a choice to do what God asked them not to do, to not do what God asked them not to do, and to do what God had told them to do. And if they had done that and continued on doing that, we would be where we are not today. We would be in the same place. We would have a perfect relationship with God. We would not have an Adamic nature that is a sinful nature. We would not be predisposed, as all human beings are, to do the wrong thing. But history tells us that our great-great-great-grandparent, Adam and Eve, made a bad choice. And the consequences of that are that now you and I, every one of us on earth, have to make a choice, either to serve God or not to serve God. We're not made to choose a certain direction, but we're made to choose either to serve God or not to serve God. And if we choose not to serve God, then if we've got any intelligence at all, we know that the outcome is not going to be good. It's not going to be good. It's not going to be what we want. As a country, it won't be good. As a nation, it won't be good, because it's not consistent with what God wants us to do and not do. So when we go on in chapter 8, it's still telling Israel to remember, don't forget the lessons of your history. Beware, verse 11 says, of Deuteronomy 8, that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, his statutes, which I command you this day, today, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten, in other words, they're going to move into this land that was prepared, developed, and planted, and the nations that had done it were benefiting from it, and they're going to get all of the benefits without having done all the work. So he says, beware that you remember the lessons of history. That's paraphrase. But remember that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses and dwelt in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied. When you move in, it's going to be there, but now you've lived there, you've become established there, you're building your own houses, and everything is multiplying. It's getting better and better. When your heart is lifted up, and you forget that the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna which your fathers did not know, he might humble you, that he might test you to do good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. Now, let's think about the United States of America in 2023. I don't know what the percentage is, but you would at least get that, as I went over the other day, 16, 17% of the people is all of the people in the United States that would say that religion is very important or the most important thing in their life. Only 16%, I think it was. That's not a very high percentage. And as we go down this road, you know, when I was in school, they began teaching sex education. And when I was in school, parents could have their children opted out of it because many parents didn't believe that children should be taught that by school teachers. In many cases, didn't even have children. But again, what's our attitude toward God as a culture? If only 16% of our population, and probably people would think that California would have a lower population than the average of the United States, but what's it say about us? What's it going to say if we don't remember the history of the nation Israel? If we don't remember the history of Babylon, if we don't remember the history of the Medes and the Persians that followed, and the Romans and the Greeks, and any other great culture you want to talk about that isn't so great today. How did they get there? What did they do? They all did the same thing. They all came to the place in their life where they chose not to obey God, not to value and evaluate conduct on the basis of what does God say in His Word. Hitler and his efforts, what was the goal? Where was God? You don't have to be a brain surgeon to go back and say, you know, as civilizations rose and fell and rose and fell and rose and fell and rose and fell, and we have risen, and are we what? Falling? Well, if you want to know, figure out what's happening as a culture in our attitude toward and relationship with God and His instruction to us. Because history is going to keep repeating itself. It's going to keep repeating itself. So again, the warning to Israel, don't forget the lessons of your history. And Israel did, by the way. They did in spades. They turned their back on the moral standards, and as far as I understand it, the majority of Jews by birth, they tend to be the more liberal and they turn their back on the moral standards that God gave to them as a nation first. When your heart is lifted up and you forget that the Lord your God brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents, scorpions, and a thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water out of a flinty rock for you, who fed you in the wilderness with manna which your fathers did not know. And then you say in your heart, by my power and the might of my hand have I gained all this wealth. When you get to that point, he says in verse 18 of Deuteronomy 8, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may be established in His covenant, which He swore to your fathers, starting with Abraham, as it is this day. At the time Deuteronomy was written. Then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God, and follow other gods, and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall perish, as the nations which the Lord destroys before you. So they're going to go in and occupy the land God had promised them. They occupy a significant portion of it anyway. And then if they forget and say, this is what I did by my power and by my might, and my hand gained all this wealth, you shall perish. Did they as a nation? Historically, they did. They did. Were they exterminated? No, nobody's been able to exterminate them. And when we move from Malachi to Matthew, there's, as I understand, about 400 years of silence from God to the nation Israel. And then he speaks to the parents of John the Baptist, the father of John the Baptist, who was to come before Jesus the Messiah, who was prophesied that they would reject and crucify and bury, and he would rise again the third day. They did all that as a people, all right. And God is no longer dealing with them in the same way that he was in those early years from Genesis 12 to the end of the four Gospels. Yeah, they perished. Are they still a nation? Yeah, they're still a nation. Because God said that they would not be wiped out. They would not be utterly destroyed. There would always be a remnant. And there would be a day in which he would set things straight. And the seed of David, Jesus Christ, the seed of Abraham, Jesus Christ, the seed of the woman, Jesus Christ, would sit up on the throne of his father David and establish a kingdom that there will be no end to. That's coming. That's coming. We don't see that yet because that hasn't been fulfilled yet, but we're told both in the majority of the scripture, which is the history prophecies relevant to the nation Israel, from Genesis 12 all the way to the end of the four Gospels, we see what God did in working with and what the consequences were for Israel for disobeying God. And it's there, we're told, the writing for our learning. Israel was an example for us. And we either will pay attention to it or we won't. And as a nation, as a culture, we're not paying attention to it. And so we're chasing all kinds of rabbit trails, trying to figure out how to solve the problems that mankind has that are a product primarily of disobedience to God. Ignoring God. In fact, denying the fact that he exists. That's almost like taking it another step. And so the wise men, as the world looks at them, the leaders, as the world looks at them, they're running around trying to figure out how to make things work smoother and better and more prosperous for all of us, while at the same time telling people there is no God. Or telling people it all happened by accident. By saying that the moral standards that are set forth in the Bible are not relevant today because things are changing. Well, there's some aspect of truth to that, but they're not changing in that they're getting any better for mankind. That there's more peace and more joy in the world now than there was 100 years, 200, 300, 400, 1,000 years ago? Not so. Not so. And so, again, verse 20, this day you shall perish as the nations which the Lord destroys before you, so you shall perish. Because you would not obey or be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. You would not be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. Okay, so we live in a culture where a significant percentage of the people don't believe there is a God. A significant percentage of the people that believe there is a God don't believe that the Bible is relevant today as to what it says is an abomination to God and what the Bible says pleases God. They don't believe it's relevant and practical for today, a significant percentage. So what can we expect as the outcome? And as I said earlier, I mean, if you think back, go all the way back to the first chapter, the second chapter, the third chapter of the book of Genesis, all the way back. At the end of God preparing the earth for mankind, all the plants, all the herbs, all of the vegetation, all of the animals, the sun, the moon, the stars, all of those, a garden for Adam and Eve. Man was created in the image of God. Eve was created as a helpmeet for man. And they were placed in this wonderful environment, and everything was very good by God's standards. Fresh from the creative mind of God, everything was very good. Sometimes we say the creative hand, and to use the word hand as a metaphor or something, that's all right. But actually, when you go back and read, God said, and it was. God said, and it was. God said, and it was. To me, it seems more accurate to refer to the creative mind of God. And God said, everything was very good. Genesis 1:31. Very good. So here's two people, a man and a woman. Eve has been brought to Adam. Adam has said that therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. They were placed in this perfect environment, like none of us have ever seen. I mean, I've been in some very beautiful places in the world, and God's handiwork is very obvious. The oceans, the mountains, the seasons, the power of the ocean in storms, the power of lightning and thunder. I've had the privilege of seeing a lot of the handiwork of God. And they had face-to-face communication with God, the Creator Himself. And they went about the business of repopulating the earth. And then in chapter 3, Satan comes and God has told Adam and Eve, okay, you can eat it, you can freely eat of every tree in the garden. But of the tree in the middle of the garden, don't eat of it, for in the day you eat, you will surely die. You'll be separated from me. You will begin, and that's in essence what death in that context is to say, separation. From me, you will immediately be separated, and your body will immediately begin the dying process. And that's what happened. But they were in a perfect environment. And Satan said, God, you won't. God said, Eve told Satan that we can't eat it, we can't touch it, which God didn't tell him that, but you can't eat it, you can't touch it. For in the day you do, you will let you die. Well, actually, Satan comes right back and contradicts what God said. And Satan doesn't do anything any different today, but contradict through the voice of those that he is the God of, as the God of this world, or described as the prince of the power of the air, the ruler that now rules in the children of disobedience. The Apostle Paul tells us that. Satan said, no, what God said is going to happen isn't going to happen. You'll not surely die, quote unquote. You'll not surely die. But your eyes will be open, and you'll be like God. You'll know good and evil. Well, that sounds great. Now I'm like God, and I know good and evil. But at this point, I have a face-to-face relationship with God, and I know all good, and everything I know about is good. Why would I want to know evil? But that's what Satan does. He tells half-truths, which makes them full-blown lies. And so Satan convinced Eve that what God said would happen, that in the day they eat, you should surely die, it was not true. So she ate thinking it was a good deal. And Adam, who knew better, went along with her. And they were immediately separated from God. Genesis 3:6-9. Their own guilt had made them embarrassed to be naked in the presence of each other. And they took fig leaves off the trees and they made aprons to cover their nakedness. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the evening, and they hid themselves among the trees from God who created the trees. Does that make any sense? But that's human reaction after we have a sinful nature. Genesis 3:6-9, the consequences of disobedience. Then Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. And Abel was, I believe in Eve's mind, the son that God said would bruise the serpent's head. But Cain was not a godly man. Abel was a godly man. Abel brought a sacrifice of an animal sacrifice, which was typical of the work of the Lord Jesus Christ, the shedding of blood. And Cain brought fruit of the ground. And God talked personally with Cain and told him, if you do what's right, you'll be accepted. But Cain would not. So Cain became the first murderer, and Abel became the first victim of violence on earth. And it didn't stop there. It kept on growing, violence on the earth. And so by the time we get to chapter 6, in the first book of the Bible, we read there were giants in the land. They were men of renown. And we also read the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I made man, made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. That's what happens when you don't obey God. That's what happens when you try to run life your way and you believe what Satan says when he tells you that something that God says is a sin is not a sin. Lord willing, I'll pick this up Tuesday night. May the Lord bless you. Goodbye.